Why is it that successful companies, even iconic companies, still struggle with disruption and often succumb to disruption? It's a topic INNOSIGHT has been working on for over 20 years, and it still hasn't been resolved. So the question is, why is it relevant, especially in this region and at this time? If we look at some of the classic case studies ranging from Kodak to Nokia, we can of course point to specific myopic decisions perhaps that the company made, or a hint of arrogance that one might detect in these quotes. But much more fundamentally, we're dealing with a lack of imagination to see a different reality. And it's interesting that when these companies were at their peak, it was almost impossible to imagine that they would be unsuccessful. Similarly, once they fell from grace, it becomes very difficult to imagine any other outcome than that failure. And it's interesting, I was listening to a speech by a retired Nokia strategy officer in 2008 when I still lived in Finland, and he described how Nokia had achieved this magical balance between strategic direction and tactical executional flexibility. And in his opinion, Nokia could never be disrupted, and it was destined for decades of success. And this was just 3 years before Elop's famous burning platform memo. And this lack of imagination doesn't only pertain to corporate leaders. When I interview young recruits for INNOSIGHT, I often pick an iconic company, and I ask them, do you think this company is in any danger of disruption? I often pick Apple because it's very iconic and everyone knows it. And almost inevitably, they say, disruption applies, but probably not to Apple. So we're dealing with a fundamental inability to imagine a different future, to imagine a different reality, but then also to make it happen in the corporate world. And it's not because we haven't studied this topic. I mean, INNOSIGHT alone has written about this for 20 years. There's dozens of books and dozens of articles. We've dissected the dynamics of disruption and how successful companies fall. And they never fall because they don't have resources. They never fall because they don't have capable management, at least capable to run the current business. And they never fall because they don't see what's happening. So it becomes imperative for all corporate leaders to understand the dynamics of disruption, to master disruption, for them to drive longer-term success. And of course, some of the iconic business leaders have taken pages from Clay's and others' books and leveraged it actively in how they ran and developed their businesses. So let me share a couple of insights from 20 years of experience in the innovation and disruption space. Why do incumbents struggle with disruption? The first reason, as surprising as it may seem, is that leaders don't really understand the dynamics of disruption. Partly because they're busy, and partly because a lot of corporate leaders are operators. They operate companies, and sometimes they don't have the time or the aptitude to look into the future. The second reason is that companies typically make decisions only on hard data. But as Clay likes to point out, the problem is that we don't have hard data about the future. And if you wait for hard data to come, it's going to be too late for you to do anything about the change that's taking place. So an apparently very logical approach to making decisions, let's be data-based, let's be data-driven, is quite lethal when you're dealing with disruptive situations. And finally, leaders and organizations don't master the analysis, alignment, action dynamic. We often think that the challenge we primarily face is an analytical one, but it's not. It's an emotional, cultural question of how organizations align behind a strategy and actually drive meaningful action behind it. And of course, this loop of analysis, alignment, and action repeats both at a tactical and at a strategic level. I was once doing a project in professional services in a business that was being disrupted, and we spent maybe 30% of the time on the analytical piece. And then we spent the rest, 70% of our time, trying to convince people of the analytical realities. And of course, smart people will never disagree with a well-constructed logical argument. But for organizations to actually respond to disruption, you need a much more visceral belief in the reality of the change. Without that visceral belief and that visceral understanding of how the business is changing, it's impossible to change any organization. There's simply too much inertia. So let's talk a little bit about disruption. It's an overused word. I think it's very much abused. Everything is disruptive or disruption is happening here and there. But if you ask certainly a graduate to define disruption, I think they would struggle. Simply put, disruption is a new way to solve an old problem. Companies should be worried when they see others who can solve the same problem they get paid to solve, and those others can solve it with a different structure, different cost base, and often different technology. And the two levers the challengers will inevitably deploy are technology and new business models. These are the two levers. I mean, if any of you were to go to set up a company that were to challenge one of the incumbents, the only tools you really have at your disposal are business models and new technologies. And one reality you also realize very quickly if you do the type of work we do is that you never challenge an incumbent using the same business model. You're bound to fail. So the only way you can challenge incumbents is to change the business model, and typically the best way to do that is to leverage technology to change the cost base. And the operative question for leaders becomes, how much can we change the cost to solve the problem in a given industry? And if you can change the cost base enough, you can challenge the incumbents. Now, why don't the incumbents react? Because the logical question is, well, the incumbents who are well-financed, well-resourced, and sometimes have access to good advice, they should clearly see this threat. The problem is that the challengers always attack from below. Now, why do they attack from below? They attack from below because the technology is not ready for prime time, and the clients at the bottom of the pyramid are most amenable to different types of solutions, often at a different cost base. And they always start small, and they're patient. Big companies always want it to be big immediately. And by the way, you have to prove that it can be big immediately. And if you can't prove it's big immediately, it's a very short discussion at the CEO summit. If we look at the framework then, this is our dual transformation framework. There's a book by the same name. You don't actually need too many slides to have these discussions on a strategy level. What we do and how we do it, if we take the automotive industry as an example, the core business is, of course, internal combustion engines. The strategy is to go SUV and upmarket. This has been the strategy of all the car companies, if one wants to simplify it a little bit. Transformation A, changing how they do it, is electrification. There's no need for strategy consultants anymore to tell Volkswagen that their transformation strategy is electrification. But notice it took Tesla to prompt them into action. But now that's a done deal. It's going to happen across the world. Transformation B is much more interesting. What do you think transformation B is for car companies? Just testing if there's been enough coffee this morning. What would you say? What is transformation B? Doing something different, but still in the automotive mobility space. Yeah, it could be all of those. I would argue it's mobility. So the question becomes, what should Volkswagen, Hyundai, Ford do in the mobility space? Should they buy the companies? Should they invest in the companies? Should they insist that Grab only use Toyota cars? That becomes a very difficult question because embedded in that question is the assumption that you'll sell less cars if people start to use mobility services in earnest. And arguably, the real strategic questions that car companies are now tackling, and the real uncertainty they have to deal with is this. This one is a done deal. And this simple slide proves it. Volkswagen is transforming an entire city into an electric car manufacturing hub. So they've made that decision already. Their next strategic question is, of course, then how they deal with mobility. Let's come back to the question of data. We all agree that we should make decisions based on data. It's hard to argue about that. But the reality is that as information increases, our freedom of action diminishes. And most companies say, let's wait a little bit longer. Let's wait another 5 years. We'll get better information. And they're not wrong about that. Of course they will. And as information increases, their freedom of action decreases. And a good example of this is retail. I just got a Twitter feed that another iconic Australian retailer went into administration. Now, when should retailers have really developed some kind of defensive strategy against the onslaught of the big internet giants? How many years ago would you say they should have done it, could have done it, might have seen it? A decade, at least a decade. And this is not only about Australia. In Finland, where I'm from, an iconic retailer that had been around for 100 years is now seriously contemplating becoming a real estate agency that rents space, which is not a very good business compared to their old business. And so the challenge that leaders have to engage with is, when do you take action? Because if you're very, very patient, if you are what we call a patient visionary, you need a very patient board. Because you're telling them the market's going to change, the customers are going to get ready, we should start investing, but it might take years and years. Who knows when the first Nescafe capsule patent was developed, that we enjoyed in the green room? When do you think that technology was developed, would you say? On the closest decade. Yeah, 70s actually. So Nestle started to invest in the 1970s in that technology, and they started to make money in the 1990s, and of course now it's a great business. So it might not be so great for your career to be too early, because boards nowadays are not so patient. At the same time, if you wait for perfect information, it's going to be game over. There's nothing you can do. You're going to be the retailer. So the real challenge for leaders from a strategic perspective is finding the right balance between information and freedom of action. And of course, embedded in this is another piece of information. Who provides the information? Well, it's your competition. And by the time your competition provides you perfect information, they will have developed the incumbent business model. And as we just heard a couple of minutes ago, you never challenge an incumbent with the same business model. So this is the discussion leaders should have with their boards. Where are we and how is the market changing? Now the next important, this next important point to make is the one I made earlier, is where are we in terms of analysis, alignment, and action? You can't really drive alignment unless you have proper analysis. Otherwise, you're talking nonsense and you're aligning people behind fiction. So you have to conduct rigorous analysis, and you have to understand the dynamics of change, the dynamics of disruption, and so on. And then you start driving alignment. And this turns out to be very difficult because people, as I said, won't openly disagree with logical arguments, but they'll nod, and then they'll go back to their day job. We actually recently published an article in HBR on this very topic, and one of our Swiss colleagues told a story of how a big telco had strategic questions, and everyone said, well, we're basically aligned, there's no fundamental disagreement on the leadership and board level. And what our Swiss colleague did was he put a tape on the floor And on the tape, he put different numbers about growth gaps, threat of disruption, other types of things. And then he told these very conservative Swiss gentlemen, they happen to be all gentlemen, to go stand on that tape on a given topic. What's our growth gap? How much is the market changing, et cetera? And then he asked them to convince each other to find a consensus position. And then when you brought it out to life, it turned out that some of the members were on one side of the room and the others were on the other side of the room. He also did this at the European CEO Summit, and there the game was who was going to win the football world championship. And all of these European business leaders had to come to some kind of consensus position on what football team would be the most successful. But they were unable to convince the Daimler team because they said we're the sponsor of the German team, so we cannot officially think that anyone else is going to win except Germany, which they did not in the end. And of course, once you have alignment, meaningful action becomes possible. But what often happens is people jump, or teams jump from analysis to action, because they've probably aligned a part of the leadership team, and the leadership team wants to show results and wants to get things moving, so they jump from analysis to action. Sometimes companies pretend that they have alignment and they jump from pretend alignment to action. These are all failure mechanisms when we talk about the disruptive piece. And it turns out that in terms of time spent in the beginning, probably 30% on analysis, 70% on alignment. And once you have alignment, then of course, most of the effort and action should be shifted to action. Let me just say a couple of words about INNOSIGHT, since it may or may not be a new company to you. We're based out of the US and have offices in Switzerland and Singapore. I'm based out of Singapore office, founded by Clay Christensen, who was the father of disruptive innovation, a Harvard professor who still actively teaches, and one of our partners who's very active in this space and writes a lot about that is Scott Anthony. And the types of things we do is growth, capabilities, and acceleration of new growth initiatives. And we're here in this part of the world to start having these conversations and to engage with companies here as well. With that, I thank you for your attention.